We're at Crops-A-Palooza 2018 in Portage, Manitoba, and pleased to be joined by Laryssa Stevenson, production specialist with Manitoba Pulse Soybean Growers, specializing in the western part of Manitoba. Laryssa, and this year we've been hearing about nodulation problems in soybeans. Can you fill us in on what we've seen and maybe what some of the reasons are for what we have seen?
Well, particularly in western Manitoba and on fields where we've never grown soybeans before, we've seen nodulation failure. And I think this year in particular it's been worse than previous years just because it's been very dry. So there's two issues that we've come across. One was very dry seeding conditions. So some of our more vulnerable inoculant formulations like liquid inoculant may have desiccated. And something like granular inoculant is a little bit more robust to moisture extremes or acidic soils. So overall we see poor nodulation all around, and then we're also starting to see nitrogen deficiency symptoms at this point in the season, and drought conditions can actually reduce photosynthate and photosynthesis all around. So nitrogen fixation is reduced. So we don't have as many nodules as we usually do, and nitrogen fixation has also been reduced.
Okay. So would we be seeing this already above ground, driving by the fields, or even just walking in the field without digging up the roots to look at actual nodulation on the roots?
You may or may not. Depends on the original soil test levels. If the soil has a lot of residual nitrogen, the crop might look very impressive, just like the crop behind us here probably has very high residual soil nitrogen levels and has had enough to get it through the vegetative stages up until this point. But now that we're getting well into the reproductive stages, we're starting to see visual signs of nitrogen deficiency.
Okay. And of course, if we dig up the roots, we'll also see nodulation hasn't happened or has only happened to a limited extent.
That's right. So we generally recommend to get into the crop at R1 or early flowers. So about 2 weeks ago would have been the right time to start looking for nodules. But at this point we should have the maximum number of nodules throughout the growing season, and most of the crops in Manitoba right now are at R3 or R4. So those pods are starting to make their way to the top of the plant, and we're just before that pod filling period where the seed begins to develop and peak nitrogen uptake is going to be happening. So at this point in the growing season, we want to make sure that we have at least 10 nodules per plant.
Okay. That leads us into the discussion around rescue treatments. First of all, the economics, and then at what point is it too late to add a rescue treatment for nitrogen in beans?
Well, a general recommendation for rescue applications would be to apply 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre at R3. So peak nitrogen uptake in soybeans happens between R4 and R5 when the soybean crop is taking up about 4.5 pounds of nitrogen per acre per day. So we want to make sure that we get that nitrogen on just before that pod filling period to supply nitrogen throughout that critical period. Some of the nitrogen applications for rescue applications went on a little bit earlier when there was visible signs of nitrogen deficiency, but at that point you're going to have to add on a little bit more nitrogen. So at this point in the growing season, if you aren't seeing, enough nodules, maybe less than 5, I would start to worry, and I would apply 50 pounds of nitrogen. And if the crop is starting to fill the pods, it's probably already a little bit too late. And certainly you want to apply that nitrogen just before rain, and you want to get that nitrogen washed into the root zone.
Okay. Do you have any rule of thumb or guideline in terms of deciding whether to go in with a rescue treatment?
There's three things I would look at. The first would be crop stage, making sure that you're not past that critical stage. The second would be residual soil nitrate levels. So if you've got, at the start of the season, 80 or 90 pounds in the bank already, that's probably enough to get the crop through to maturity, and you probably won't see any return on your rescue application. But if you've got lower soil test levels, like maybe below 40 or 50 pounds, that's where you'll probably run out of nitrogen at that peak stage. So that's another factor I would take a look at. And then of course nodulation. We recommend having at least 10 nodules, but if you've got somewhere between 5 and 10, again, you might have enough nitrogen to get you through.
Okay. Finally then, Laryssa, you mentioned the differences between the different inoculants at the start of the season. Would you recommend in the future, if it's a dry spring, dry start to the growing season, not using a liquid inoculant?
Well, I think in particular, cropping history is the most important factor in when selecting an inoculant. So if you've never grown soybeans before, my recommendation would be to use a granular inoculant. We also have a recommendation to use a double inoculation strategy, so using another form. So typically that also means a liquid on the seed, but if it's dry, granular inoculant is by far the most robust formulation. If you have grown soybeans before on a particular piece of land and you've had good nodulation in the past, there's probably adequate rhizobium levels in the soil, so inoculant formulation is less important.
Here comes the rain. So thanks for your time, Laryssa.
All right, thanks.